welcome. And I don't anticipate that this webinar will take an hour and a half, but we want to really kind of dive in a little deeper on the SBIRT program, the screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, and also some dynamics that have developed around this in terms of funding, future funding. We are at the 1 year mark in terms of our grant with Walmart. And Walmart has shifted its focus to workforce development, um, which doesn't jeopardize any of their current programs working in criminal justice. All of those are fine and will remain the same. But some of those programs have looked at workforce development, which is a big issue or concern with Walmart. They employ about 480,000 young people, one of the largest youth employers in the country. And the foundation has increased its budget up to $165 million that they're going to be giving out in 25 and 26. Um, and initially, when we were encouraged going into this cycle of funding to not so much focus on the specifics of police reform, but to focus on youth deflection and ways in which we could strategize to keep young people out of the criminal justice system. Our sub-grant awards have been really focused on programs or initiatives designed to keep young people out of the criminal justice system. And related to that, we started exploring the whole issue, and we'll get into this more specifically about uh, chronic absenteeism. And we've talked about that before on our webinars in terms of really creating presence within school and keeping young people in school. And we'll have some statistics, and Lexi Sundberg is going to be reviewing sort of a lit review she's done on the issue of absenteeism. But since COVID, uh, absenteeism has gone off the charts, and it's having an impact on school attendance, obviously, and also dropout rates. And it's creating risk in the area of crime, violence, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy, and other issues. And we're discovering that we partner or can work with community groups or school districts on strategies to keep young people in school. We see crime going down and we see violence going down. And uh, Walmart initially was skeptical about this approach, but now they're enthusiastically behind it. The only barrier that we face is that uh, Act Now, or the Rockefeller Philanthropy, which is the grantee in this initiative, cannot apply for another grant until this grant expires. Uh, the solution to that is to identify a partner that could submit the grant on our behalf and work with us on this initiative. So we are in active conversation with Attendance Works, which is a national organization that focuses on this issue and really innovative. They love what we're thinking about doing and focusing on specific districts. And right now we're looking at Schenectady. I know Nashville is also working on a school-based initiative, and Oklahoma City also has the potential for that. Uh, but we have to design the thing first, and then we will submit probably a major grant with Attendance Works sometime this spring. Once we go through all the hoops with Walmart. Also, John Bridgeland, the co-founder of Act Now, is going to be looking for some other grant sources with us over the next several months. These will be resources that we can provide to the local sites, Act Now sites. You have to participate in Act Now in order to be a part of this program. And so, again, it can be any aspect of touching with school or young people around youth deflection, anything that would contribute to keeping young people out of the criminal justice system, and particularly as it relates to our schools. Um, any questions on that before we go into the substance of this? Is that I'm feeling really positive about this strategy in terms of it being funded and the partnerships that could be developed locally. For example, in East Harlem, which is coming on board as one of our new sites, Youth Build is located in East Harlem, Dorothy Stoneham's work, and they are very interested in these issues of keeping young people in school in terms of skill development. And so those are the kind of partnerships that we can forge that would be helpful. Uh, so I'm going to start off with well, first of all, any questions on anything I've said so far? Can't see all of your hands, but if not, we'll move ahead.
Yeah,
By the way,
Jim, I do have a quick one. Well, maybe not a quick one. When you say that the program still needs to be kind of designed and everything, is there is there part of a way for us to be part of that process, or is there updates or some way to keep kind of keep some sense of where that's going, or how do we, I guess, how do we stay informed or involved?
absolutely. In fact, you have to be a part of that process.
Good.
This isn't going to be done to you. It's going to be has to be done with you. And so I'm meeting with ACT now the week of the 25th. Excuse me. Uh, Attendance works the week of the 25th, and we're going to talk about our planning strategy, but getting input from you, the work that you're doing, and we're going to have some discussion about that today to capture that information. But you're very much involved in the design process, and more specifically, the communities you work in and the school districts that you work with need to be at the table as we begin to flesh this out. So we're in the very early stages of implementation in the design phase. Yeah, Justin, very much so. And this group will be kept informed regularly on the progress. And if your site chooses to participate in this initiative, then very much you need to be involved, and your community needs to be involved. So,
Great,
and some
thanks.
of you have youth advisory groups or are developing youth advisory groups. Having young people participate in this discussion will be extremely important um, to get their thinking and their views.
So Jim, this is really the first step in equipping you with enough background to sort of understand what the landscape looks like. And Lexi's research will be helpful in that. As we move into now the more deep introductory discussions with the partners and then with the funder. So
Yeah.
first step.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, just a reminder um, of what our mission is. Um, get this out of the way. Now, ACT now gathers together grassroots community members, local leaders, civil rights activists, law enforcement, government agency, faith-based and community organizations, and others from diverse communities who seek to mobilize for meaningful change. This mission is now going to more narrowly focus on the relationship of young people to education and the importance of education. That doesn't divert from what you're currently doing. In fact, under this current grant, you need to continue to do what you're doing. But as you continue to be a part of ACT Now, and as we continue to work out our relationship, the SBIRT program, the screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment to keep kids in school will be important. By the way, I should have introduced at the beginning, most of you have been on previous, but Sarah Spaeth from Bryn Mawr College. She and Darlene Bailey will be working with us to help design questions and to get input. And they're one of the two or three organizations besides QSIDE and Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation that are working with us to measure and evaluate the impact of the intervention. So Sarah is on, and so welcome, Sarah. Glad you're a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a minor correction, Sarah Spath.
I'm sorry.
to pronounce my last name with
I should know that.
It's okay, it's common. But good to be here. Good to meet everybody.
Good. So ACT Now sees an America where people work to eliminate the root causes of poverty, racism, and the forces that bolster the social inequities that undermine and threaten many of America's communities, which is our vision. So context, school attendance and active participation in the process of education is a strong predictor of living successful and meaningful life without the threat of drugs, violence, and crime. The more a young person is engaged or connected to the education process, and which is the education really, it's interesting. It comes from the Latin word to be led out from, and the educare, which is connecting to the entire educational process. That's not always just limited to what takes place in a school building, but it can relate to homeschooling, it can relate to community-based organizations, interactions, anytime, anything that informs or equips an individual to deal with the broader context in which they live. And the more you're connected to that environment, the research clearly shows that it reduces the threat of drugs, violence, and crime. So Nicholas Kristof, in his new book, Chasing Hope, talks about, I'm a strong believer that the best predictor of where a country will be in 25 years is its education system. And right now, the research is clearly showing that there is a fundamental threat to the education process as a result of COVID and other stressors that are on our systems to keep young people engaged in school. And in terms of school, the entire process, after school activities, the relationships, teacher-student relationships, classroom sizes, all of those things are variables that continue to put stress on schools. Um, as some of you may know, but many of you probably don't know, I'm a former school principal and assistant superintendent of schools, and I was an adjunct professor of education at Wichita State University. And I used to say a good teacher can teach anywhere. If they had to teach in a barn, they will use other things as chalk. They are um, they are the backbone of our system, and how information is communicated. And Christoph, in his book Chasing Hope, is again a New York Times um, columnist, talks about the threats or undermining what's undermining education today. So, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to give this quote, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lexi, and I'm going to have her kind of go through what the literature has been telling us about a school attendance, and then we'll come back and look specifically at the experts model. But the most recent federal data shows that in the 2021 school year, at least 14.7 million students nationwide were chronically absent. This means that chronic absence was almost doubled from the more than 8 million students of pre-COVID-19 who were missing so many days of school that they were academically at risk. And so you can see how those numbers have increased and how COVID was a contributing factor to that. So I'm going to bring up the slide deck for, there we go, slideshow. And Lexi, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through this. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, so I have written a lit review that is on Circle on, I believe it's in the library or the resource section, and you are free to go peruse that as you want. There's like 30 to 50 sources. I can't remember how many I culled, but there's about, yeah, there's a decent amount of sources. Chronic absenteeism is generally defined as missing 10% or more of the school year for any reason. That works out to about 2 days per month, or about 18 days over the school year. Sometimes people can use chronic absenteeism and truancy interchangeably, but there's actually a little bit of a difference. Truancy is unexcused absences. It varies by state how many you're allowed. Also, there tends to be a little bit more of a legal responsibility with truancy, while chronic absenteeism is any absence for any reason. So that's sickness, travel, mental health days, skipping school, suspensions. Anytime you're not in class, that is a chronic absentee. Not in class for 10% of the school year, that's a chronic absenteeism. It has jumped about 20 to 30% in every district in almost every state post-COVID. Some states or some districts even more, but it's a real big problem. And then students who are absent for truancy reasons generally have a disinterest in school and fail to see the relevance of their daily life. Chronic absentee in general, there's lots of different reasons, but if they're truant, if they're not wanting to go to class or go to school, it's generally because they are disinterested. All right. Absenteeism is cumulative, which is a really big problem. And it's also descriptive. So attendance rates in kindergarten are indicators of poor attendance and poor academic achievement in the future. So by 6th grade, chronic absences can indicate the likeliness someone will drop out of school. Absenteeism in the 9th grade is a better predictor of dropout rates than test scores. So they can be, a high achieving A student, but if they're chronically absent 10% of the time, they're more likely to drop out. It's cumulative a lot of times because school builds on skills that you have to learn and be there for all of the lessons to learn, not just subjects like math and science and literature, although those are really important, but also social skills, how to be leaders, how to interact with people, confidence. All of these are things that you learn in school and are cumulative. The students with the highest absence rates in kindergarten are not likely to catch up with their peers by 5th grade. They tend to not be able to read or do math as well on standardized tests as their peers. And if you are chronically absent for 10% or more of a school year between 8th and 12th grade, you're over 7 times more likely to drop out. And that your likelihood of being chronically absent doubles with every year. Yeah, it's cumulative. This is the really important part. All right, next slide. To be absent in school can cause a lot of problems in adulthood or on your further education. This is college, but a college graduate is likely to live 9 years longer and have lower infant mortality rates than someone who has graduated high school. This can be for a variety of reasons, like better job opportunities, better information about health and medical services, better access to medical services. There's lots of reasons, but it is you can see in the data that it's more likely to live 9 years longer. It is strongly associated with the increased risk of teenage pregnancy for a variety of reasons. One is if you're not in school, then you have more time to get in trouble. You have more time to meet people who are older, who may have less morals, who are more likely to take advantage of like a pretty vulnerable teenage girl than if that girl was in school with her own peers. Chronically absent teenage girls may believe that they do not have much to lose academically by becoming a mother, and they may engage in more risky sexual behaviors. They also may not have the good foundation of health and education that can help them to not engage in those sexual behaviors. It is estimated that 10 annual days of absence in elementary school decreases total lifetime earnings by 1 to 2%. This is probably because it interrupts those important skills that I talked about earlier. And schooling significantly reduces the probability of interaction with the criminal justice system, particularly for men and particularly for minorities. So it is not only for minority men, but those are really affected. And then so men who graduate high school save society between 14 and 26% in crime reduction. So that's because they're less likely to commit larceny, they're less likely to commit burglary, to murder, all these things. they're less likely to be in the prison system. And so they save society between 14 and 26%. And interestingly, I haven't found any more updated research on this, but in 2004, at the time of the paper that I read, a 1% increase in high school graduation will ultimately save as much as $1.4 billion at the time, which is $2.3 billion in 2025, or about 2,100 per additional graduate. So that the societal burden is a lot less if you graduate high school. So there's a lot of effects that absenteeism has on adulthood. That is not to say that if you are absent for 10%, you're automatically going to go to prison or, you know, be a teenage mother or whatever. It's just more likely. And yeah, it increases your risk of doing those behaviors. Also engaging in substance abuse is a really big, yeah, when you're absent, you're more likely to engage in those. There's some really good interventions, though, and best practices for students that are chronically absent. There is a resource on the Lit Review called "The Attendance Playbook: Smart Strategies for Reducing Student Absenteeism Post-Pandemic" by Phyllis Jordan. That if you are in a school or dealing with chronic absenteeism, it has practically every any strategy that you could want, as small as like greeting people at the door to more involved family intervention policies. It has the research behind it has whether it's accurate or yeah, it's just a great resource if you're involved in absenteeism. I highly recommend that one. Some of the top interventions and best practices from that and from around the internet are family engagement, that is intervention that is early and often, including direct personalized strategies like letters or texts to parents and home visits from teachers or staff. One school district reported a 21% decrease in absenteeism when each family had one visit from a teacher or staff member, just to say, hey, how are you doing? Like, how's your kid enjoying school? It is a really big burden on school districts, but if your district or school has a lot of absentee students, this might be something to think about. Curriculum reflection is also a really good strategy, basically, particularly for students that think that school isn't relevant to their daily life, making sure that the curriculum that they're in is relevant, but also have them reflect on that relevance, whether it's through essays, through discussion groups. If you have a kid sit down at the end of a lesson and say, okay, how can I apply this lesson to my life? They're more likely to stay in school and more likely to return to that class because they can see the relevance of it. If you have the resources, universal free breakfasts can decrease absenteeism by 4 to 6%. That we're still needing more data on this. It's still an early thing, but particularly for places that are food insecure, having one more breakfast that is healthy and free really just prepares students for the day and helps them stay in school. Particularly for elementary students, air purifiers can increase attendance in really drastic ways. One of the largest reasons for absenteeism in kindergartners and in elementary school students is asthma. They're not able to breathe properly, and so having clean air in classrooms can really improve attendance. And honestly, this is not helpful for high school students, but for future generations, really, it's best to target the younger students as soon as possible. Once you get to about 8th grade, then it really becomes dire if you're absent. If students have already made decisions about risky behaviors, those cumulative effects are already coming into play. They may be missing those discussions on absenteeism because they are absent. So teaching the importance of school attendance needs to begin really in kindergarten or 1st grade. We need to be telling students, hey, this is important to your life. It's important to who you're going to be as an adult for you to be in school. And then finally, a really easy way, I say easy, but it's not very easy or simple, but school connectedness is one of the biggest factors in keeping students in school. School connectedness is how much a student feels like they belong and are supported by their peers, by their teachers, by school staff. This is really intangible, but it's extremely important because in order to succeed and stay in school, students need to believe that both their peers and adults in school support, value, and care for both their academic achievement and individual well-being. Research suggests that school has a protective factor on children and adolescents. So if you have a child that is in a really negative, has a really negative home experience, a really bad family, bad neighborhood, school connectedness and being in school can help that those effects of that childhood be mitigated. It can't completely cancel out having absent parents or being in a bad neighborhood, but it can really help shield the worst effects of that. And it can also help children be more resilient and able to heal from those negative experiences. Community is really important even for kids. And so making sure that they feel like they're a valued member of that community is, it contributes to them staying in school. And then finally, adoption of an early warning system is repeatedly deemed the most effective, catching students at the very first the very first beginnings of their absenteeism before it can really set in and begin accumulating, can stop the negative effects of absenteeism in its tracks. This early warning system should be based on intentional relationships with students as well as their parents if possible, and should include mental health services and social emotional learning problems. So welfare or social workers in school, teachers that care and are engaged. And this is really where we can begin to see SBIRT being a real big factor. If you have a lot of adults who are interested in your life and how you're doing in school, you're really more likely to stay in school. So that's my pitch for not being absent in class. Thank you.
And again, the lit review is on Circle. So I encourage you to take a closer look at it. Any questions for Alexi? I'm not.
I just have an add-on comment,
Uh-huh.
which if we reflect on our theme of belonging, meaning, purpose, and well-being, that school connectedness, that's where those dwell. And so they fit there. So every child being known by name, every child feeling connected to at least one adult in the school that cares about them, knows them, has a relationship with them. Those kinds of very basic things go to school connectedness.
Yeah, and having an adult who knows your name and says, "Hey, I noticed you weren't in class earlier. I noticed you weren't at school yesterday. Is there something up? Can I help you with anything? Like, were you sick? Was there a problem?" That can really boost a child's feeling of a child's self-worth, and also just connectedness and belonging as well.
Looks like
Daryl, Colleen, and I worked at the National Crime Prevention Council with a former school principal in East Hartford, Connecticut. And he took over a high school that had a 48% dropout rate. And the one simple intervention he did was every adult in the school were assigned students, and every student was known by an adult by their name, and simply calling them out by name as much as possible every day and creating that sense of belonging and connectedness. He reduced the dropout rate by 65% and became Teacher of the Year in the state of Connecticut. Those simple interventions, low cost, high impact, are important to remember. Any other questions on the lit review?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment.
Uh-huh.
Much of what those statistics drive, albeit a lot of years ago, is my life story. And as someone who has just finished my children's education journey, my kids are 31, 26, 24, and 18. What it was when I was in school and what it is now is very different. Much of it is punitive. Everything from I've seen personally children being fed different food, which is asinine to me, as a punishment for being late to school, being made to wait until after children who have been on time to school to be able to get their meal, to after school detention. And one of the things that I think some of the consequences to tardiness, consequences to absenteeism is void of is the understanding that children up to a certain age and sometimes even beyond that don't govern themselves. And so they are at the behest of their parents who may not have gotten up on time or have other issues in the household. So I would love to see more statistical information and more safety net information, wraparound services around what the households look like, and what's being done to involve the entire culture. It's great. And I agree. I had teachers who knew my name and I had teachers who poured into me. I've told the story before of my seventh grade English teacher who at 47, I'm still in contact with, and see anytime I'm in New York. But there needs to be more than that. And we have to stop punishing children who do not have the autonomy to govern themselves because their parent is lacking in some way. We can't fix all of the things, but in particular, that punishment aspect of it and that ostracizing of students who um, are late or habitually absent from school creates more of a disenfranchisement from the educational system than it does a connectiveness because they now are being punished and singled out in school for things that they have zero control over. And then that begins to lead into the behavior issues and all of that stuff. I was that A student that got suspended every month who was out of school all the time. And I was 2 credits away from high school graduation and got a GED because I was a 16-year-old mother. So I'm super interested in this, super, like any opportunity to have those conversations and be connected to this research and the work that's being done, in particular, James, in East Harlem, because that is actually where I went to school. Those programs you are talking about are programs that existed when I lived in East Harlem. That is where I grew up. So I do have a pretty decent frame of reference as it relates to that, as both a parent and a student who went to school in the early 80s.
It's interesting. 9 states have, to that point, Kim, in terms of punishment, 9 states have adopted legislation punishing students for being truant. And it puts them in the criminal justice system or in the juvenile justice system. And it takes a punitive approach. They call it accountability, but it really turns out to be punitive. And I know that attendance works, and what we're interested in is keeping kids out of the criminal justice system and creating that sense of belonging or connectedness.
That playbook that I shared about earlier, the attendance playbook, that is all non-punitive, really compassion focused strategies. They address truancy a little bit in the end, but really a lot of this school belonging and school connectedness is compassion forward, really looking to involve the whole student and the whole family unit in reducing absenteeism. And a lot of the research there does say that truancy doesn't, or penalizing truancy does not work as
Yeah.
well as as well as the justice system would think it.
So one of the variables I know in our conversations with uh, attendance works, that children living in poverty are 2 or 3 times more likely to be chronically absent and face the most harm because their community lacks the resources to make up for the lost learning in school. Students from communities of color, as well as those with disabilities, are disproportionately affected by this strategy. Looking at those things, as Kim pointed out, in terms of home life, family life, employment opportunities, the social determinants of health, but the things that contribute to putting young people particularly at risk. So I want to get your input or your thinking, and I want you to start off sort of a personal question, if you're willing to share. What was your relationship to school? Kim kind of shared hers. What created presence or belonging? In Kim's case, it was a teacher. I know in my case, it was a teacher. But I'd be interested in hearing from some of the rest of you as to what it was what made school important to you, um, or valuable. Feel free to just jump in or raise your hand. Be sure your mic is on, um, if you would.
This is Tiana, and I think just as a follow-up to what Kim said, I also came from a very uh I don't know, unfortunate upbringing, I suppose, dysfunctional actually. And I was sharing with Lexi, who's my daughter, and I knew that she was doing this research, and I was just saying that I have strong memories of third and fourth grade and being chronically absent. And Kim talked about the teacher that made a difference in her life to keep her in school. And I told Lexi that one of the reasons that I was chronically absent was there was a lot going on in my home life, but also, ironically, my third grade teacher was named Mr. Love, and he was horrible and he was mean. And anytime I was absent, you come back and you recognize that you don't understand things, right? You've missed context. And he would he would shame me in class because of that. And so what does that do? That then creates the desire to not come back again. And it's cumulative. So uh, I would say I can think of teachers that helped me, but the teacher that stands out in my mind is actually Mr. Love, and how his interaction with me created created more of a problem for me.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Uh, well, if I when I went to school, I'm in the Bay Area, and I grew up in Oakland. But I lied about where I lived in order to go to Berkeley schools, which are much better funded. And a lot of people in my school did the same. Um, but yeah, I know for myself and for a lot of the other people in my grade, there was some difficulty because of, frankly, our home situations, and people not wanting us to either A, know we lived in a different state, but also, my dad was a drug dealer. I know a lot of other people in my family weren't necessarily um, friendly to the idea of eyes in the home, and sort of knowing what was going on at home. So that was a sort of barrier, I think, to a lot of connectedness, and really was a barrier for me until I kind of moved, stopped seeing my father. And I think that that helped me with my educational situation. But just a little added context. I don't know if that's relevant to the conversation, but it was something I was thinking about as I was kind of listening to this talk about connectedness and sort of the barriers to that.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
I'll
And
share
then
something.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I've had similar experiences as what's been shared, but something I wanted to add is there was a girl in our grade, in junior high and high school, who knew everybody's name. And as we'd go through the hallways, she would say it was hilarious, like to walk with her from class to class because you couldn't really have a conversation. She was busy saying hi to everybody by name. And there were many, many days that I was not feeling like I was belonging. And she'd walk past me in the hall and say, "Hey, Tanner, how are you?" And I think that was rare, but I think it just sort of highlights to me the impact that one person, especially a youth who's in the same situation. I think part of the act now where we're aiming is to empower youth to be leaders in this space. And in some cases, the teachers aren't doing it, like what Tiana shared. And I think there is an opportunity that students who care and want to create that. I mean, that happened for me. She created that for me and hundreds of others, which was kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah. I know we had a son particularly who was so bright and so quick, he was bored. And it took a lot of leverage on the part of Colleen, particularly, to keep him engaged in school. And there was a borderline dropout in large measure because he was so bright and wasn't always recognized that what he was receiving in instruction wasn't really helping him. Other thoughts on your relationship to school?
Um, I can share a bit about my story. So I am originally from El Salvador, and I think during school there, I sort of had this extrinsic motivation that eventually became my own. And so at that time, my parents told me, "Hey, we can't afford for you to go to college uh, at the place that you want to go to, you know? So it's all in your hands to have a performance and that will allow you to hopefully get some financial aid, get a scholarship, and achieve those opportunities." So I think that eventually became sort of my motivation to, and which eventually shaped also my relationship with school, sort of seeing that as a clear pathway to my goal and as a way that I could attain what I wanted.
Good, Carlos. Thank you. Daryl, were you going to say something?
I was, Jim. I can relate to the boredom situation. I think that was Stephen you were referencing. I'm not sure. But
Yeah.
when I was in high school, I was terribly bored and did very well academically. So I could miss 3 days of school in a week and still catch up or get caught up and still get good grades. And it wasn't until uh, I ran for office, class president, and our sponsor, if you will, the teacher that was in charge of overseeing the elected officers, said, "Well, you don't have to go to class if you're bored, but you need to be here physically and you can hang out in my office." And that's what I did and he eventually got me back to going to classes 5 days a week, but I was really bored in high school.
Yeah.
Jim, I'm going to add a kind of a positive story because I think I really appreciate the comments that have been shared because they give great insight on the constructive side of what is it that we need to have happen for children to succeed. My situation was having a mother. I'm the oldest of 8, and I could read before I went to school because she had taught first and second grade. And so she instilled in us a love of reading, and we would read together every day. We read together every night. With my children, I read to them constantly from the time they were in utero to adulthood. And if you ask Jim, all of our 24 grandchildren, we are voracious readers because my mother loved reading and taught it to us, and then we passed it on. And so encouraging parents as first teachers and equipping them with the tools and the importance and the value of reading is a positive and something that schools, when we think about a holistic approach to education, we're not just talking about what happens in the classroom. We are also talking about empowering families and caregivers with the tools to create nurturing learning environments. So that's part of the school connectedness includes their families need to feel connected to school.
Yeah.
And to just piggyback on what Colleen says, it brings to mind something that I talk about a lot, which are the intergenerational deficits coming from the inner city and coming from public school in New York City and raising my children through public school in both Pennsylvania and in Texas, as well as New York City. what you fight up against. I went to school during the crack epidemic, so there were all of those things that existed in that, right? But as I became a mother, I was 20 when my first child started school, and I had my second child. Um, Over the 30 years that I've been involved with the educational system, what I see a lot of is parents who are not empowered to question, parents who are not empowered um to buck up, so to speak, against what it is and the evolution of the educational system that exists for them. But then that is compounded by the fact that I am the child of a baby boomer who had their own set of whatever issues, right? And now I wasn't read to as a child. So it's not necessarily intuitive for me to then read to my children as I'm having them as a young mom. And those were skills that I had to acquire. They were not innate with me because they weren't given to me. So y- I think that one of the things that sometimes gets lost is the deep-rooted impact of that intergenerational deficit, that community of children, those community of people who have children to stay on welfare, the community of people who have never experienced those things and are told by schools how to manage and deal with their children, and or never make it to the schools at all because of disinterest, which I think is a very small percentage. I think the larger percentage is people who work odd hours and can't get there or have 2 and 3 jobs or what have you. So I want to make sure that the work also looks at the totality of the situations, again with the caveat that I know we can't fix everything, but we can't be remiss in not mentioning that it's the totality of it all, and it's generational, not just those kiddos that are in school right now.
Very helpful, Kim. Thank you.
I'd say one thing that strikes me, and I appreciate everybody's perspective on this. It's great to get a better sense of what everybody else got out of school. But I know for me, school felt like I wanted it to be a place I wanted to go because I didn't want to be at home. Uh, and some years, if I had a great teacher, that's what it was. And then you'd have whiplash with the next teacher, where you'd have a teacher that really wasn't as engaged or as engaging with students like me and like probably many others, that we wanted school to be the refuge, and some years it was, and some years it wasn't. So that I think is quite a challenge, and I suspect that that I think that's something that a lot of students go through.
Yeah. As a former teacher, one of my favorite questions that a student would often ask coming into my room, Mr. Koppel, are we doing anything important today? No, we're just going to sit around and twiddle our thumbs. As an administrator, though, as students were sent to my office, I used to tell teachers that in the classroom, whatever, it's your responsibility, accountability belongs in the classroom. You send them to me as an administrator, then it becomes my problem and it becomes my solution. And so if you can't solve the problem in the classroom, go ahead and send them to me, but it's now my problem. And I discovered in that boredom was a big issue, and also lack of support, also working 2 and 3 jobs to support the family. It became a critical issue. Well, I'm not going to take the time to go through these other 3 questions, but I want us to give these questions to be in front of us as we go forward in the design stage. How we make the case, how education does influence workforce development and capacity to develop the workforce and to get it secure employment. And then also to be articulated in our local communities around school attendance as an influence on substance abuse, teenage pregnancy crime, youth-driven violence, and employment. And there is a study that Project Unloaded is about to release, that the Joyce Foundation is supporting, in terms of juvenile gun engagement. The number of young people that engage using guns to do crime, what is the relationship to school, and also the whole school shooting issue in our country. But why is attendance an issue or a problem for America's schools? Keep those questions kind of in front of us. I want to very quickly just go through the strategy we're going to be developing in partnership with Attendance Works is borrowed from the substance abuse field, where the American Academy of Pediatric Medicine encouraged doctors to simply ask the question in an exam, what's your relationship to alcohol or to drugs? That question itself was a screening that could give guidance to do a brief intervention. And so a doctor could call the school, or they could call, give guidance or counseling on how to secure help and around a substance abuse area. We piloted this or experimented with this model when I was at the National Crime Prevention Council in Ketchikan, Alaska, where school attendance was a real problem. And we applied the screening brief intervention, getting employers and others to ask the question and then to refer them to an intervention to do an intervention. In fact, the question itself is an intervention and getting someone to think about it. And then you can refer them to the appropriate resource or treatment strategy. And so we're kind of taking that framework out of the American Academy of Pediatric Medicine and applying it to what we want to do in schools to keep kids in schools. The community school stakeholders, and you'll learn more about this as we develop this, is getting attendance navigators in the schools. That could be somebody that's in charge of attendance. It's employers, coaches, faith leaders, parents, grandparents, community leaders, and others that we will be training or informing them on what the issues are around attendance and then how we would train them to do the intervention. So we're going to be working with Bryn Mawr to help design the question that these community stakeholders could be asking in order to do the screening and then to better understand what the resources are for the intervention. So the question really that we're going to be answering in all this is how can SBIRT be a contribute to or be seen as deflection, keeping kids out of the criminal justice system. Any comments on that concept of how this can help keep kids out of the criminal justice system?
I think it absolutely can contribute to keeping people out of the criminal justice system, where you have buy-in and where you have hope and where you have the idea for the future, then you are considering doing things that less lead to criminology, basically, just the whole idea of I need things and this is how I'm going to get it because I don't see another way to do so. So by providing another avenue that keeps kiddos invested in being contributing members of society and they can actually see that. It's one thing to tell someone you can be whatever you want to be when you grow up, right? That's kind of that cliche statement. But to create a system where you actually can see it and where it's being capitalized on. That same English teacher in the 7th grade was the first teacher who told me I could write and, put me in charge of the school newspaper as the editor. And she continued to cultivate that thing in me, despite bad behavior, despite, all kinds of suspensions for fighting and violence and all of that other stuff. She continued to cultivate that one thing in me that stuck with me throughout the years. And it was the hope that I needed to do other things moving forward. And so we need to create that one thing in kiddos.
Other thoughts about it in terms of deflection, and it's not necessarily, I mean, I keep using the phrase keeping kids out of the criminal justice system, but it is also sort of changing the paradigm, if you will, on making kids employable and also making kids healthy, helping to make kids happy, helping to sense of well-being and belonging. That these kinds of interventions, when they're carefully designed, can contribute to that. Other thoughts on that question? Yeah.
I appreciate that it's also, you can think of it using sort of a social work framework, not just a micro intervention on with the students themselves, but also the macro piece. You had what, like 11 different types of community members, and going back to the mobilize piece from the mission, right? You're mobilizing the social community around the youth.
Right. One of the challenges, or at least one of the questions that was raised, is those stakeholders, those community folks that we just listed here, and there's obviously more than this. Why do they have an interest in this? And I think it's almost inherent for a young person who stays in school or continues their education as a protective factor against crime, violence, substance abuse, etc. It's going to make them better employees. It's going to, setting academic standards or being helping a student develop. Um, I was a football player in high school, and I was a mediocre student, about a C average student. And I had a coach who helped really encourage me to read. I was not a reader. I did not grow up as a child reading. That was not a big thing that I remember. I don't ever remember my mother reading to me, and it just they she assumed I could do it, and it wasn't a conflict issue. It just I never did it. But I had a coach who really encouraged me, and I also had a minister who really encouraged me to read, which made me very curious and made me wanted to stay in school and contributed to that. So, any other thoughts on that question? Well, this is the website for Attendance Works. I encourage you to look at that. And I also tell you that the state of Rhode Island has developed, the governor there has developed a statewide strategy on the issue of chronic absenteeism. And really taking on the issue because it has a relationship to workforce development. It has a relationship to all the things that we've talked about today. And I think as we go through this project, we'll probably identify other states where this is a priority. But as we bring on new sites, again, not everything that we have to do in Act Now has to be expert, but I think this is our opportunity right now with our current funding. And as we add mini grants or more mini grants to sites, showing the relationship. I think, Justin, I think of your project in terms of Talk a Mile, where you're getting young people talking to law enforcement and you're setting up these structures and you have a youth advisory council, getting youth voice and these kinds of things. That in itself is an inherent protective factor for young people. And so it's not a stretch in the least in terms of what you're doing. So, any questions before we close or any comments?
Maybe I'll just say, I've been spending some time looking at Know Your Rights resources in light of immigration and what may be happening with the new administration. And I think that, as I listen to all of this, I think, and what happens now if we have kids not showing up for school because they're afraid of ICE raids and those kinds of things. So my point simply is that however dire this situation was, I fear that there's an increased that it's a darker moment going forward for this issue if the administration pursues some of the promises that it has made.
Yeah.
I think, Tian, if I can add to that, not just along immigration lines, but in terms of education and funding to education. I've talked to a first grade teacher this last Sunday, has 27 in her classroom, 27 first graders. She's trying to teach them how to read and number recognition and just lining up, herding cats. You know what I mean? So there's a lot that at stake for sure.
Well, one of the things, and we'll close with this, we're going to put together a youth advisory committee on this project to help design this element. If you have young people that you're working with in your community that you think would be helpful, send me their name. You can do that through Circle or send me an email as we put together this youth advisory group to help design this, to get their input and get their thinking. And it would be
Jim,
very helpful. Yes, Daryl?
do you have an age range for that youth group?
I would say middle school through high school.
Yeah.
However, I think one of the questions we're going to be wrestling with, and it goes to what we discovered in Lexi's lit review, is the earlier the interventions, the more likely we are to keep kids engaged. And so this may have ramifications. Quite frankly, when we started thinking about this, we were thinking high school. And then we realized we needed to also talk about middle school, that was a critical point. And I think Lexi's research kind of illustrates that. But also the early identification of at-risk behavior in as young as kindergarten, in terms of what's happening. We may wind up expanding it to elementary, but for the advisory group, I would say middle school and high school at this point.
Jim, do you have a blurb or any sense of what the expectations would be for a student that would want to get involved?
No, but I'll get you one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got
I'll
a
get-
couple that come to mind, but I'd love something to send on to him just to start that
Yeah.
conversation.
Yep. We
Thanks.
can get. Okay. Thank you for all you're doing, and we will be in touch. And next month, our webinar is on what date? Tanner, do you remember? February 14th, is it?
It's the 12th, February 12th,
Oh.
isn't it?
February 12th. Okay.
It's Tuesday, February 11th.
Oh, my
Oh.
bad. February 11th.
February 11th. All right. We'll send out a notice accordingly. Okay. Thank you, guys. Good to talk with you.